So this talk today is kind of different to the other portable talks that we've run. There's a lot of storytelling, anecdotes, feelings, and Joe, our design lead, is going to kick off all the feels, empathy and design, and what to do with it.
Thank you, Hannah. Thanks, Hannah. Empathy. Webster's dictionary defines empathy as... Oh, look, you know what? That stuff's important, but it's actually not what today's talk's about. This is a talk about real-world experiences, real-life experiences, not dictionary definitions. So, hi, I'm Joe. Thank you all for coming today. I've always been fascinated by emotion and empathy. It's permeated a lot about how I communicate and work. And when I chose this topic for today, I didn't actually know what I was going to be talking about specifically, but I knew there was enough there for me to pull something together. So hopefully you get something out of today. So I grew up in an Italian home. As you can imagine, there were a lot of feelings. Combined with that, I was a pretty sensitive kid. So I once actually cried at a Shirley Temple documentary. To this day, I still don't really understand why. It wasn't even sad, it was just about how talented she was. But in spite of all my sensitivity as a child, I didn't really express my emotions very well. I either played at being unaffected by things or I exploded in anger at the smallest things. I actually saw a child psychologist for a while, and each session would go something like this. I'd be sitting here and the child psychologist would ask me a few questions about home life and school, and I'd answer. And then we'd sit in silence for the remainder of the hour. I'm talking like, 50 minutes just sitting there without a word being said. Now, I don't know if this was some kind of strategy to induce like a breakthrough Goodwill Hunting moment in me, but it didn't work. All I was thinking about was how stoked I was to be off school for an hour and the inevitable McDonald's my mum would buy me on the way home. So, needless to say, during my teens and early 20s, I still wasn't very in touch with my inner emotional life. And as I grew into a young man, I found new ways to avoid feeling things. Mainly involving spending most of the day in my pyjamas living in my mum's basement, eating McDonald's, playing with Photoshop, and losing myself in Star Wars video games. Uni life. But my creative escape was in drawing. But after studying art at uni, I decided that I didn't really have that much to say. But what I really enjoyed doing was solving people's problems, particularly the sort of problem solving that you do through design. And so I took up a few freelance gigs and I started doing that and I loved it. So I started doing it full time. And one of the best things about it was that it allowed me to work at home in my pyjamas. So it fit my video gaming, McDonald's eating, non-emotion having lifestyle quite well. But whilst working at home had its benefits, there were limited possibilities for genuine connections with other people. All my client interactions were over email, and I had even fewer opportunities to actually connect with the people who would be experiencing the things that I was designing. It was all guesswork. I was mastering my design tools, I was working on fun jobs, but there was no relational aspect to what I was doing. I wasn't connecting with others. Meanwhile, in my personal life, I continued to be terribly out of touch with my emotions, maybe because of growing up in an environment where expressing emotions often resulted in blame and shame. I was actually afraid to feel. If you asked me how I was at the time, I probably would have given you the classic response. But in spite of all this, I still considered myself to be quite emotionally connected. Primarily because I could actually empathise well with others. Like most people, I understood empathy to be feeling what others feel. Whilst I could empathise with others, I had a hard time trusting that others could empathise with me. I was a great listener, but I only ever shared my story as a way to validate somebody else's. I didn't trust that others could truly empathise with me. Or rather, I didn't trust that others could empathise me in the way that I wanted them to empathise with me. And the way I wanted them to empathise with me was by feeling my suffering as much as I was, sinking down to my level, and let's just wallow there for ages. If you weren't wallowing in suffering with me, then you didn't really get me. As a result, in most relationships, I didn't have a lot of trust, but in my closest relationships, I had unrealistic expectations of what empathy looked like. As I grew into adulthood, I got into a long-term relationship with my now amazing wife. I was emotionally immature, emotionally needy, and emotionally manipulative. Thankfully, I was super good looking, or she never would have given me a chance. Inevitably, emotional content that had been safely buried began to bubble up to the surface. and I had no idea what to do with it. I was still freelancing at the time, but that was becoming more and more isolating as time went on. So, inspired by the desire to be around and learn from other designers, I entered into full-time studio life at a great company full of amazing people just around the corner from here, actually. And at the time, I didn't know empathy had anything to do with design. The company wasn't really geared that way. But when the opportunity to do user research arose, I leapt at that opportunity. But ultimately, I was disappointed when it turned out to be little more than a photo opportunity for some marketing material. I didn't have the confidence or knowledge at the time to really articulate what was missing from my work, but I was never quite satisfied with the approach we had to design. However, I was excited to be working around other designers and a fantastic team, and we were producing really great work, but we just had no idea if it was actually satisfying the people it was designed for. So it was around this time my wife fell pregnant with our first son. I was still really interested in understanding my inner life, and being a soon-to-be father gave me even more motivation to get my shit together. So I knew I had this affinity for empathy, and there was something really powerful about that, but it was incomplete. So I thought, what's a way I can study and analyze my inner life and relationships without having to feel any of those pesky emotions, feelings, yuck. So enter meditation. The style that appealed to me most was Vipassana. Has anyone heard of Vipassana? A few people. So it's a rather detached, analytical approach to investigating the nature of reality, which appealed to me, my cognitive sort of side very, very much. Vipassana has actually evolved into modern day mindfulness, so you're all probably quite familiar with the approach. You know, you just sort of be the witness, be the calm observer, watch the thoughts and feelings and the body sensations travel by on the river. I'm over here, the experience is over there, it's all good. As a huge Star Wars nerd, I felt like a Jedi in training. I got so into meditation that a couple months before my son was born, I decided to go on one of those 10-day silent retreats. Has anyone been on one of those 10 silent retreats yet? So if you're anything like me, you're probably still crapping on about it 5 years later. So by sitting for hours on end in the same position, no distractions for 10 days, no music, no movies, no TV, no books, no talking, the idea was that you'd learn to detach from your experience, so much so that you're no longer identifying with it. For someone who desperately wanted to disown my emotions, this sounded like a really good plan. So I applied myself diligently, and I did experience genuine moments of peace and freedom. And I learned to calmly let my emotions arise and pass with effortless ease without reacting to them. When I got back home from the retreat, I thought I had it figured out. All I had to do was set up a nice, quiet environment, no distractions, no unwanted sights or smells or sounds, and I would be totally free from having to deal with my emotions. And then my son was born. Not only did I not have time to meditate, but I was now dealing with a whole new realm of emotional reactions that I didn't even know existed in me. But I did my best to stay strong. Part of that was actually questioning my natural affinity for empathy, which had started to feel more like a weakness than a strength at times. Like maybe being empathetic was opening myself up to being manipulated or taken advantage of. So I did what most people would do in such a situation. I went and spoke with a Buddhist nun. Her name was Venerable Robina Courtin. Is anybody familiar with Venerable Robina? No? So she was a radical feminist activist in the 1970s before becoming ordained as a Buddhist nun. She spent years doing compassionate work in maximum security prisons in the US with people on death row, and she now travels the world giving amazing talks on empathy and compassion and being your own therapist. She's incredibly fiery and not to be fucked with. She rules. Following a talk she gave on compassion and the work she does in prisons, empathizing with rapists and murderers and people on death row, I bumbled my way through a question about, how I'm an empathetic person, but I don't know if being empathetic is opening myself up to being taken advantage of, and I really want to connect with other people, but it's really hard, and maybe empathy is actually a weakness, and you're a Buddhist nun, and you can connect with people really easily, but you do heaps of meditation, and I'm a dad, and I don't have time to meditate, so what about me, And her response really stuck with me. She said, "Just because you're empathetic doesn't mean you have to be pathetic, darling." Now, her words really helped. They helped me hold on to empathy as a valuable skill, but I still had these annoying emotions to deal with. So I went deeper down this spiritual rabbit hole, searching for something that would truly allow me to transcend my pathetic human emotions. And what I found was holotropic breathwork. Anyone here heard of this? Couple of people? So it's a day-long workshop with a group of participants engaged in a breathing technique to produce a non-ordinary state of consciousness. It was developed by a couple called Stan and Christina Groff, I believe in the 70s. Stan was actually an early pioneer of LSD research, and holotropic breathwork is often described as a psychedelic trip, but without the drugs, which sounded just fine to me. So I was hoping for a cosmic adventure that would take my meditation to the next level, but what I got was something completely unexpected. But around that time, I began looking for something else work-wise. I'd reached the limitations of what I could achieve as a designer at my previous company, and I wanted something more. So I found Portable. What attracted me to Portable was the human-centered approach to design. They actually used words like empathy and purpose to describe what they did. Now, I'd known about human-centered design, but I thought maybe it was just this academic thing. That's just what those guys at IDEO do, and it doesn't actually work in the real world. But then when I heard Andrew, one of our founders, say, "We're going to be the next IDEO," I thought, oh, okay. And I took that and ran with it. So I was pumped to work on some juicy, emotional projects, and I was ready to finally bring empathy into my professional life. And then I got my first project, GovMap. It's Google Maps for government land. To be honest, I was a little deflated at first, but I dove in, and in fact it turned out to be the perfect proving ground for a budding empathist such as myself. And here's the big secret I learned that will allow you to bring empathy into your work, no matter who you are, no matter what you do. You ready for it? If there's one practical tip you take away from today, this is it. Talk to people. Talk to the people you're designing for. It doesn't matter if they're vulnerable people, marginalised by society, or if they're public servants just wanting to get the job done. They all have needs, they all have frustrations, they all have motivations. And that's all the juicy stuff we need as designers to actually design stuff that's going to work. So what I learned from talking and co-designing with people in government was that public servants are actually driven by incredible purpose, but often feel frustrated by the bureaucracy of the systems that they're working in and the lack of accessibility to data that empowers them to make decisions that benefit all of us. I also learned another important lesson on GovMap. Many of the people I spoke to had zero interest in sharing their deepest, darkest feelings with me, but GovMap helped broaden my once narrow definition of empathy. It's not just about feeling what other people are feeling. It's about building understanding of another's context and problems. And that can actually be quite an analytical, cognitive approach. So what was to follow over the next year at Portable was a series of intense learning experiences regarding empathy and design. So buckle in. Not long after GovMap, I had my first project that I'd call Emotionally Juicy. It was for Breast Cancer Network Australia, BCNA. Now, our users were women recently diagnosed with breast cancer, and our solution was a digital tool to offer help and information, in the days and years following their diagnosis. We were designing the onboarding experience, getting them into the app, signing up for the app itself. And because I felt terrible for these women in their situation, I decided to get them through it as quickly as possible. So I only asked the necessary questions of them throughout the experience, and I made it as easy and painless for them to get through. Good user experience, right? I thought I was designing an empathetic solution, but I was wrong. What we learned when we tested with women with lived experience was that they needed more context to slow things down. They'd be signing up for this moments after being told they had breast cancer. They expressed a lot of discomfort about being rushed through a series of very personal questions without much explanation as to why. I felt sorry for them, but I didn't really take the time to understand their emotional situation, and it resulted in a bad user experience. But that's why we test. The next juicy project was Headspace. Headspace, the National Youth Mental Health Organisation. So as part of our research, we had the opportunity to talk to young people from around the country about their mental health, and whilst empathy with those young people did indeed play a huge part in the design, what I was surprised by was how important empathy was in understanding the client themselves. We knew there'd been some organisational challenges at Headspace, as with any organisation of its size. As I was building confidence, I decided to some more adventurous research methods with them. So I tried something called Lego Serious Play. Has anybody heard of this? Yep. So this is a generative session where you use creative expression to go beyond talking and verbal responses. And you get responses from people that you wouldn't get just by asking them a straight up question. Now what we found was this session gave everyone in the room a voice, everyone from executive level down to content people, to marketing people, to clinical psychologists, the whole gamut. And together we were able to reach a shared understanding that beyond all the internal challenges of the organisation, at the heart of everyone's motivation was the desire to make a real difference in the lives of young people in Australia. And I discovered that human-centred design is not just about end users, but all humans involved in the delivery of a solution. The learning continued on Jesuit social services. We were tasked with designing a preventative child sexual abuse support service for adults concerned about their own sexual impulses that they may have towards children. Now, as you can imagine, this presents a huge design challenge. We knew it was crucial to build and maintain empathy with these users. So in a workshop with our stakeholders, we ran an empathy mapping activity. People familiar with empathy mapping? So this is where you stick up with what a person thinks, feels and says and does in a certain situation so you can start to build an understanding of who they are. The activity worked as intended, but one of the stakeholders said, "Where's the victim in all this? We're spending all this time talking about this potential perpetrator, but where's the victim?" And in what felt like a bold move, we stuck to our guns. We explained that actually the victims are not our users. Yes, ultimately they're the people that we're aiming to help, but our design problem was one of prevention. Our users were potential perpetrators, and they were the ones we needed to understand. And our empathy with them was already hanging by a thread. So it was extra important that we keep our focus there. Thankfully, one of the clinical psychologists in the room spoke up. "This is the big problem in this space," she said. "And this is what this service is addressing. There's no prevention. No one wants to deal with this issue because it's too challenging." And then we get to Red Cross. This is a project that's currently in the works, and what I'm seeing is potentially the biggest opportunity we have for empathetic design yet. We have the opportunity to talk with people currently living through an experience of an uncertain visa in Australia, asylum seekers. Compelled by previous lessons we've learned and the value of empathy becoming more and more clear to me, I saw this as an opportunity to further embed the empathetic approach into how we work. But there are risks when trying to communicate this empathetic approach to others. I've had the benefit of preparing for this talk. I've done like 2 dry runs. I said it to my dog at home. So I've practiced it and I can get my communication straight. But normally when I try to advocate for an empathetic approach in the room in the middle of a meeting, it looks something more like this. But guys, come on, feelings! And usually that leads to people rolling their eyes and perhaps becoming a little embarrassed for themselves and me. And rightly so, nobody likes to be emotionally manipulated. Forcing your collaborators into feeling something, whether it's for you or for someone else, is tantamount to a hostage situation. So don't wield emotions, whether yours or somebody else's, as a weapon. And be an advocate for people, not an evangelist for emotions. But how do we advocate? The answer is stories. Rather than communicating how you feel, how something made you feel, communicate the story itself and trust that a good story well told will get the job done. There's no need to oversell it. Now, this project with Red Cross also presents a huge problem with no simple solution, just by virtue of the subject matter and what we're dealing with. And we know we had to do more than usual to build empathy. And it's not easy, but we're learning lots of hard lessons as we go. One thing we've had to immediately ditch is seeing our user group as a species. We had to stop seeing them as asylum seekers and start seeing them as individuals. Sure, many of them have common experiences and motivations that unite them as a group of the problem space that we're trying to solve. But when you're in conversation with someone, they're an individual, not a category. And we discovered so much individuality and unique preferences from person to person that are affecting what we're learning and how we're going to be designing solutions. For example, some people seeking asylum, we're doing a lot of work around their social connectedness within communities. And some people seeking asylum really prefer to be around people of the same cultural background, who speak the same language, have the same similar experiences, and you can understand that. But we can't apply that to everyone just because that's a few people we spoke to. In speaking to more people and digging into it, we actually found that there's another cohort entirely who, for very good reasons, don't want anything to do with people who look like them, sound like them, come from the same country, because they've endured immense trauma to escape that and actually come here. And so there's the risk of persecution and repeat trauma from that. And so if we didn't bother exploring those individual differences, if we saw them as a species, it's likely our solution would only work for a small portion. We also had to ditch the fear of getting it wrong. This is messy stuff. And we need to accept that when we're dealing with empathy, emotions, people's experiences, failure is going to be an inevitable part of this journey. We're not going to get it right 100% of the time, and that's okay. But we do need to stay open, keep listening, and have humility. And we also need to be willing to throw out the script. So we need to seek to learn new things, not just validate what we already know. In one conversation with a gentleman we had in Brisbane, after we asked him the usual series of questions, I just opened it up and said, look, what's a usual day look like for you? When you're not like seeking help or, coming to Red Cross for some emergency relief, what does a usual day look like for you? And he's like, I love going to the library. I'm reading this book about Princess Diana at the moment. I said, oh, really? Yeah, tell me about that. He's like, oh, well, whenever I go into the library, the librarian says, oh, we've got a new book in on Prince Charles, like, come have a look. He's like, I love the royal family. I'm like, oh, really? He's like, yeah. He's like, when Princess Diana died, she was really good friends with Mother Teresa. And a week after Princess Diana died, Mother Teresa died. Do you remember? I said, yeah. He said, I'm sure the reason she died was of a broken heart. Now, look, on the face of it, we didn't really learn anything that you could say is going to, inform our design solution, obviously. But it really made this person into a human and gave us a much deeper understanding of who these people were, who they might be, the kinds of interactions they might have. And now we're considering, for example, libraries and public spaces, community spaces as really viable options, for our solutions. But perhaps the most important lesson I'm learning about empathy in design is that it gives us the motivation we need to solve these huge problems. Now, we're not going to solve the refugee crisis, but with empathy connecting us to the people we're trying to support, we have the courage to see possibilities where before there were only problems. Okay, back to breathwork. So what I expected from breathwork was a trip, transcendence, a cosmic journey. But what I got was something else entirely. Now let me just explain to you the physical setup of the space. So there are some mattresses, there's about 16 people in the room. There's really loud music playing for the duration of this 3-hour breathing session. The group's split up into breathers and sitters, so you've got people lying on the mattresses and then a sitter for each who's looking after their physical comfort. And you've got a couple of facilitators holding the space and doing an incredible job of creating an environment of trust. I can't speak more highly enough of them. All the breathers have their eyes closed, so I'm there with my eyes closed and I'm engaging in this breathing technique, which is actually quite simple. And the instruction given, also quite simple, breathe into whatever's happening, trust the experience, lean into it. So there I was, lying down, eyes closed, doing this breathing, this music's pumping, feeling a little bit awkward. And after a few minutes, I started to notice my fingers and hands tensing up, my arms tensing, my shoulders. My whole body started contorting, my face, like this. Still doing this breathing, and now my habitual meditation mind kicked in, the witness, the observer. This is interesting. What's this? Body sensations, tension, yes, okay. Just let it go, just let it go. But then I remember the instruction from the facilitator. It was really counterintuitive for me. Don't let it go, breathe into it. Make it bigger. If you have to, express it. So I remembered that. And it took a lot of courage, but I made it bigger. I tensed even more. I contorted my body even more. I felt this tension in my throat, and before I knew it, I was screaming my fucking head off. And I just exploded on the mat. And when that calmed down, and I had the awareness to sort of say, what just happened there? I realized what had happened. It was an emotion. Not just any emotion, it was anger, rage. This is what I'd been suppressing all that time. This is what all that meditation was in aid of trying to get away from. And my arrogance became really apparent to me in that moment. I thought I was above it all. I thought I was able to transcend my humanity. But instead, what I discovered in that moment was surrender, humility, and vulnerability. The session came to an end, and throughout that time, I did indeed experience some cosmic transcendent moments, but they didn't really compare to what I learned from that moment of anger. The session ended, and people started getting up and moving off to quietly talk about their experiences in another room, but I was stuck. My eyes were closed, I couldn't speak, I couldn't move. I was incredibly ashamed. One of the facilitators came up to me and, we started quietly talking about what was going on. And I said to him, I just don't think I can open my eyes. I don't think I can actually look another person in the eyes right now. I'm so ashamed of what I've just gone through. And he said to me, you can look at me if you want. And it took all the courage I had to just open my eyes and look this guy in the face. And what was reflected back at me was complete openness, non-judgment, love. And I just broke down into a blubbering mess. I then had the incredible experience and honour to sit for other people going through similar heart-opening experiences. And I'm so grateful for that experience and what it taught me. And none of this would have been possible without trust. So, looking ahead, we're now looking for ways to bring empathy into our work beyond just talking. And I realise we're already doing it in some ways. So we co-design, which is the way we ideate with users and people and stakeholders. And I've started seeing these as generative sessions like Lego Serious Play. It's immersive creative research. We're not just interviewing people, we're actually getting people to tell us what's important to them by building it, by constructing it. And I'm learning from IDEO as well. So this is an example of some innovative research that IDEO is doing. They were tasked with solving the problem around terrible wound care experiences in crisis situations in hostile environments. So they had these tents set up, and they were tasked with making this a better experience for these patients who are getting their wounds treated. So in order to get their designers to empathise with this situation, because obviously they couldn't send them into these situations, they set up an environment and they actually got their chests waxed. Now, this is a way for them to sort of empathise with what it feels like. Now, I shared this internally with our team, and Alicia, one of our producers, actually said, yeah, great, clearly a man came up with this, with this research method. You know, yeah, it's like getting a fucking gunshot wound getting waxed. Like, why don't you just talk to a woman? And so even IDEO has a lot to learn about empathy, but they say that research processes and techniques should be tailored to the design challenge. This means that we need more permission from our clients and ourselves to try new things that have yet to be perfected. And what about keeping empathy alive? So we do these things called problem statements, which you may be familiar with, which is a way to sort of just summarise what someone might be feeling, or what the problem is. They're useful, but they're not enough. What is enough are stories. So we're currently doing this research and design project around death and dying, and it's a huge subject matter. And whenever we're in these design meetings, in these conversations, it's really easy to get lost in the weeds when we're trying to think of solutions for how we make this a better experience, create a better dying experience for people. But what always brings it back is people telling stories, personal stories. When my mother died, this is what her experience was. My grandfather, my cousin. These empathy pauses are hugely important, and it's the responsibility of everyone to be contributing these to the conversation. Even for people for whom empathy is lacking, it's their responsibility to ask for it when they need it. Projects need understanding, enthusiastic champions who will tell and retell stories to keep empathy alive. We're currently experimenting with new ways of communicating empathy beyond the typical reports and personas, which we'll be excited to share soon. I'm writing a blog post which is more comprehensive than what I've spoken about today. Some of the questions you guys have submitted, thank you for that, will inform that. There's also the question of designing empathy into our solutions, so it's all very well and good to keep it alive and tell stories and talk to people, but how do you actually execute that in designs? There's a whole other talk there. As for me, I'm still figuring things out as I go. I'm still making contact with my emotional self, but I won't lie, it's been challenging. I'm expressing myself more, sometimes in healthy ways, sometimes not. And I am still meditating, and I'm learning to do it in less than ideal situations. I've still got a long way to go. I'm making lots of mistakes, but I'm seeing strength in vulnerability where I once saw perceived weakness. And I'm using empathy to aim for understanding, which creates a whole new form of emotional expression, communication. Empathy doesn't mean I need people to suffer with me. It just means that I need to communicate my needs in a way that creates a shared understanding. So, Webster's dictionary defines empathy as the action of or capacity for understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experience of another, of either past or present, without having the feelings, thoughts, and experience fully communicated in an objectively explicit manner. Lots of words, but the one word that's crucial to understanding empathy that's missing from there: trust. In an environment of trust, I discovered the courage to confront doubts, fear, and shame. So I could finally own my emotions, not bottle them up inside, not project them onto the others, but actually own them. And I finally discovered the courage to empathise with myself. And if I can do it, so can you. Thanks, everyone.